Hello. Welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson. And if you are just joining us for the first time, welcome. We are so happy to have you here. I hope you enjoy really creepy stories, especially from history. That is what we do here. And if you have been following along from the beginning, thank you so much for your support. I also hope you are enjoying these stories. It has been really fun to do all of this research and find stories that a lot of people don't know about. I don't know about. So it has been really fun. So make sure you're liking and subscribing and sharing this channel with whoever you think would enjoy some creepy tales from history. This week, we are doing another recommendation from a listener. Thank you, James, for this suggestion. And if you ever have a suggestion of someone that you want to hear about that I haven't talked about yet, feel free to send me a message on Instagram. It's just Horrible Humans in History, or you can message me here and I will take a look and we will for sure do an episode on someone that you want to hear about. But today we are doing James's recommendation, and I have to say this person is someone I had never, ever heard of before. So fantastic recommendation, because I guarantee none of you have heard about this person before. And today, the person we are going to be talking about is the evil Bluebeard. Now, Bluebeard is actually a fairy tale that I'll talk about a little bit later because it would give away so many spoilers. But when I was doing my research, something super eerie and really creepy happened, because as I was doing my research, I looked up serial killer Bluebeard, and I found a man in France who actually is who I said I would be doing the podcast on, but that's not actually who James wanted to hear about. So we will be doing the French version of Bluebeard at some point. But it was really eerie because these two men both lived in the late 1800s to the early 1900s, and they both committed basically the same kind of horrible crimes. Almost identical, and it's kind of creepy because, like I said, one was in France, and the other, the one that we will be talking about today, was located in California. So it was really creepy because I'm doing the research for this podcast, and they matched each other, and it was so eerie, and they were located across the world from each other. Now, there are slight differences in their stories, but they're so similar, it's scary. So, like I said, I know I said I'd be talking about the French Bluebeard, but I changed my mind because I want to make sure I cover who you guys actually request. So, James, we will be talking about the California Bluebeard. And ironically, the Bluebeard from California didn't actually have a beard. The one from France, epic beard. One in California, no beard. He just has really creepy eyes. So today, we will be talking about James P. Watson and how he gained the nickname of Bluebeard, especially since he did not have a beard. So join me as we explore this chilling tale. Now, I want to point out, like I mentioned at the beginning, I had never heard of James P. Watson or James P. quote Bluebeard unquote Watson. And I feel like his story is really getting lost in the sands of time. It's slowly being forgotten by time because this guy doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. And just so you know, I don't actually use Wikipedia that much in my research because anybody can put whatever they want on there. So I don't use it a lot. But this guy doesn't even have a Wikipedia page. Like, that's how unknown he is. So it took a lot more digging to get his story for you. And I am excited to share this because I like to bring you guys stories that you probably have never heard before. And this one is pretty epic. So keep that in mind. There's not a lot of background detail for him, but we're going to do our best. So James P. Watson was born Charles Gillam on January 3rd, 1871 in Carroll County, Arkansas, in the United States of America. When he was a child, his mother actually told him that his father had passed away, but when he was the age of 9, he actually found out that his father didn't die. He had just abandoned him, and that caused some intense trauma for him. And his mother actually remarried and decided that at that point, she needed to change her son's name. So she changed James P. Watson's name to be Joseph Holden after his new stepfather, which isn't confusing at all. And don't worry, like all good serial killers that we have talked about before, he changes his name quite a few times. So his mother started him off on the right foot by changing his name a couple times. He went by a couple names. He was also known as Walter Andrew Watson, Charles Newton Harvey, James R. Hilton Hurt, and then William B. Hurt. So I don't know what it is about all these serial killers and having this desire to just have multiple names and change their names a lot. But man, if you have listened to any of my episodes, you know this is a pattern. So we will talk about him as James P. Watson or just Watson for the rest of the episode. But just know he's got a ton of names and was known by a ton of names, including Charles Gillam. So, anyways, so he actually clashed pretty immediately with his stepfather. They did not get along, and his stepfather was incredibly cruel with especially the punishments that he dealt to the boy. Watson would even claim later in interviews that his childhood was full of mental and physical abuse from his stepfather. And this prompted Watson, aka Joseph, to run away from home at the age of 12. And, you know, from 12 to about 17, his life is pretty vague and we don't know a lot about it. We do know he opened a business that was somewhat lucrative. And at the age of 17, he would marry his first wife under his given name, John Gillam. And her name was Mary Holginsworth, or of Coffeyville, Kansas. They were childhood sweethearts, and they were madly, madly in love with each other. But right after they got married, their marriage quickly soured, and they soon divorced. Now, you probably noticed that I said his first wife. Yeah. Remember our episode about Henry VIII? If you haven't had a chance to listen to that one, you should listen to it. But Henry VIII and his 6 wives have nothing on Watson. I'm going to tell you right now how many I'm not telling you right now. I read that wrong. I am not telling you right now how many wives he had. Watson had a ton. And I will tell you at some point how many he had. But just know that it's way more than 6. So Henry VIII, you got nothing on this man. So from that point, after he divorced his first wife, he turns up in Canada. So we don't know a lot about where he went, how he came to be in Canada, and all of a sudden he's going by James P. Watson. So we don't really know a lot about his history, where he came from, where he went, all of that kind of stuff. We do know he was married and divorced. He had a business. That's about it. Super, super vague. So when he finally shows up in Canada, it's because he marries his second wife in 1913. He married Catherine Cruz of British Columbia. And one day, Catherine Cruz's husband, James Watson, just disappeared. He never came back, and she wasn't actually entirely sure what became of him. He didn't even give her the courtesy of giving her a divorce so she could remarry without breaking the law, because it was against the law to marry someone, obviously, if you were already married. I mean, seems pretty logical. So she was married to this man for the rest of her life, not knowing if he was alive or dead or anything, but she could not remarry. And you know what? She actually got pretty lucky, and you will see that she escaped some pretty dire consequences for being married to that man. So I can tell you that many of his wives would not be so lucky as her. He did say later, so Watson later in a confession actually said that he had no violence attempted on her, had the impulse, but was able to resist. Wow. How strong of you. That was so, so brave that you did not harm your second wife. Good job. So in 1918, he would marry 3 other women, 2 in Canada and 1 in Seattle. And I'm not meaning like married, divorce. No. Married. 3 women. He's already married to 1 other woman. So he's married to 4 women at this point in time. So he's got 2 wives in Canada, 1 in Seattle. And it always blows my mind that people can cheat on their significant others. And this story, like blew my mind to a point that I just don't understand. Because first of all, cheating on your spouse is horrible, despicable. And if you're doing that, I don't like you. And yes, I am judging you. But secondly, how do you juggle that without any of your wives or girlfriends or whatever finding out that you're doing it? That is what blows my mind about this case. This man has 4 wives already. How did they not know? How did they not know? That is what I don't understand. Because I guess there's reasons why they probably wouldn't know. Like, for example, he told many of these women that he married that he had a traveling job. He had a job that required him to travel a lot. Like, he told them, I'm a very high up bank executive and have to go visit multiple banks. Or I work for the federal government investigating bank robberies and I need to go inspect this and blah, 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 blah. So he had a lot of excuses. So he was away a lot. And so I guess they always assumed he was at work. So he had good alibis to cover for himself. But the more you learn about this guy, the more your mind will be blown, as mine was, as to how he was not discovered sooner. It is just shocking. So his wife from Calgary, Marie Austin, would be the first of his victims that Watson would kill to get out of his way. Now, before I tell you how he killed poor Marie Austin, I want to talk a little bit about my impression of this man. So, obviously, every time I do research, I gotta Google pictures of the people because I like seeing what people look like and putting a face to the horribleness, I guess. So anyways, I did find this quote from someone at the time of his arrest that is a pretty great description of Watson. So when asked if Watson was a handsome person, this individual said, "He must have been a winning gent who had a fascinating way, but no, he had a feline face, a wolfish mouth, a fruit of air, as shy a beauty as of grace, yet he won brides most everywhere." That's what they said about him. And like I said, I'll be sure I post some pictures of this guy in my Instagram, but he, to me, looks so creepy. He has some of the most soulless eyes I have ever seen on a person. And he was 5'9", weighed just a little over 120 pounds, and was very mild-mannered. So after seeing his picture and knowing kind of his personality, I too was confused as to how he got so many women so eager to marry him, and not just marry him after an extended courtship. No, it was fast. It was weeks. It only took him weeks to convince them that they wanted to marry him. So he had to have been a pretty smooth talker and quite the charmer at this time period in which he lived, because he got so many women. But I guess the time period in which he lived is actually something we should think about. That probably actually helped him, because most of the women he married were all pretty well educated and cultured women. So what was the deal? Let me explain. So some pretty big historical events were taking place around the time that Watson started marrying every woman who would give him the time of day. So first and foremost, the Great War had just ended. Now, if you're not familiar with the Great War, let me change the phrase. It'll help. That is what World War I was called before World War II happened, because, there wasn't any world wars. It was just the Great War. So that's what it was referred to at the time. So the Great War, aka World War I, had just ended. This is important because many women had actually been widowed because of the Great War. Their husbands had gone off to fight in the war and died. So they were left widowed. In addition to the Great War, the Spanish flu had just blazed through the United States. And for some perspective, in World War I, 16 million people were killed worldwide. The Spanish flu killed 50 million people worldwide. So it had wiped out a ton of people in the United States. And the population of men was specifically hit hard because the flu swept through the military first. It hit the men in the military because, like I said, they were just finishing up the Great War. So they were in these trenches together in these horrible, horrible environments that bred disease. So it spread super quickly. So many of them had died in World War I and then come home and died of Spanish flu. So the population of men was just basically destroyed between the war and the flu. So there were a lot of widows out there who had lost their husbands in the war or to illness. So women at this point in history were still pretty dependent on their husbands, not only financially, but also socially. A lot of progress had been made, so women could vote in that kind of thing, or they were getting close to that. But for the most part, women were still really dependent on men. So to be a widow at this point in time was not ideal. This was a very, very hard time to be a widow. Being a single woman was not great. So they definitely would not have liked Beyonce's song, Single Ladies. That is for sure. because it was just such a tough time in history to be a single woman. So with that in mind, with that background and a little bit of history for context, there were a lot of women that were kind of, how do I say this diplomatically and nicely? They were just kind of desperate for a husband. They just needed a man, basically. So Watson knew that this was happening, and he would find his new wives by placing Lonely Heart ads in the paper, which were very common. It was a very, very common thing to do in the 1919s. Think of the Lonely Heart ads as like the dating app of the time. This is how a lot of people met other people that were single and looking to get married. So think of him as a troll on a dating app just looking for desperate women. Basically, that's what he was doing. So he would place ads in the paper that would read, and I quote, "Would be pleased to correspond with refined young lady or widow. Object, matrimony. This advertisement is in good faith." Sounds familiar, right? I feel like we've heard this before from someone else we've already talked about. So, catfishing, still a thing back in the 1900s. So, women would respond to his ad. They would write him a letter saying, "Oh, dear sir, like, oh, hi, introduce myself. I want to marry you," basically. So they would correspond through letters, and he would woo them, and he would give them flowers and send flowery letters until he could convince them to come and meet him in person. So when he finally did meet these women in person, he would shower them with gifts, with like perfume and flowers and candy and even sometimes really expensive jewelry. And he would take them on rides on his fancy car and just convince these women that he was just the perfect gentleman. And he would just create this feeling of this whirlwind romance for these women, especially women who had been so lonely and so desperate. Like, there were a lot of women that had never been married, or the widowers who just felt so lonely. And he created this whirlwind romance where they were just swept off their feet. So when he proposed just a week or a few weeks later, or even sometimes days later, they wouldn't be able to resist. They would just be like, well, he's just so amazing. I can't say no to this. This is fantastic. So, side note, I do want to point out, because as I was reading this and like thinking about these single ladies, I was single for a really long time. And when guys would do this kind of stuff, when I first met them, it freaked me out. It was like giant red flags that like flashed in my mind. Like, what is happening? I was super suspicious of their motives since they didn't really know me very well. So as I was reading this about these women, how it's just like, oh, they knew him for like a week and then they got engaged and whatever. I can't understand it. Like, because to me, that would be like giant red flags. Like, why is he so desperate to marry me so quickly and he knows nothing about me? But I also was a very independent woman that was totally okay being single. And these women had a very different life situation than I had when I was single. Because nowadays it's a lot more acceptable to be a single lady. Back then, not so much. So I get it. But for me, this would have been giant red flags of this man just showering me with all of this expensive stuff. I would have been, I don't know, I'd have been really nervous about this dude. But these ladies felt very comfortable, and many of them said yes immediately when he asked if they would marry him. So when he would marry these women, he promised them really lavish things like, oh, I want to sweep you away to Hawaii and we'll take a romantic honeymoon there. But they would marry him, and then after they got married, he'd be like, oh, I need to go finish this work project, or I need to go here and do this thing. So he never fulfilled any of the promises that he made them. And hint, these were not work projects he was working on. In case you didn't pick up on that, it wasn't work. He wasn't leaving for work. It was for all his other wives. So he never fulfilled any of the promises, but he would move them around. He would drag some of his wives around with him until he just got sick of doing that. And you'll see what happens when that happens. Because now we're back to what happened to poor Marie Austen. So Marie Austen would be the first of many victims, but her death was incredibly violent for being the first wife that he killed. Watson actually beat her to death with a rock and then dumped her body in a lake near Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. He even weighed her body down with rocks so that no one would be able to find her. And then he quickly moved on and married another woman from Seattle. And don't worry, he cared so much about these women that for this wife, he couldn't even recall her name. That's how much he cared. He didn't even bother to remember her name. And this becomes a pretty common theme with Watson. When he was finally caught and being interviewed by the police, he'd just be like, oh, I don't remember her name. Or, yeah, I remember the dates that I got married, but I don't know who I married. Why would I remember the person? Jeez. And he often called his wives or his victims, the wives that he murdered, I finished it off. He did not personalize them at all, but he couldn't remember half of their names. That's how many women he did this to. So anyways, he married this new wife, and the one that he could not remember her name, and they went on a honeymoon to Spokane, Washington. But this poor woman wouldn't survive the honeymoon because her new husband pushed her off a waterfall where she was then crushed to death at the bottom by the rocks. And when he was asked, why did you do it? Why did you push her off of a waterfall? Did you get in a fight or something? Was there a reason? And his response was, there was no controversy, just an impulse. So he killed her just because he could. That's it. They were literally romantically gazing over this waterfall, and he thought, what would happen? Yoink, and he pushed her off of the waterfall. And then didn't even bother to remember her name. This man. Blah. So in 1919, after he pushed this poor woman off of a waterfall, he began to drift around Tacoma, Washington, and started putting out his ads again, seeking another wife to marry, and he found two unlucky women. He married Maud Goldsmith in January of 1919, and Beatrice Andrew Wartha in February. Now, Beatrice would be his next wife to be killed. She lived a little bit longer than the nameless wife that Watson had killed. She actually lasted all the way until spring, and that is when they took a romantic trip to Lake Washington near Seattle. And while on the water, Watson, quote, felt something come over me, end of quote, and threw Beatrice into the water, where he would force her head under the water until she drowned. So this man does not have a consistent way of killing his wives. It's just whatever impulse hits him at the time. Now, I want to point out that if I have not mentioned one of Watson's wives' names as a murder victim, then that means he is still married to her and she has no idea that he is, one, married to multiple women, and 2, killing multiple women. Just ponder upon that. You were one of his wives, didn't know that any of this was going on. Now, I will say that just because he didn't kill them does not mean they weren't victims. I mean, obviously they were victims because they married a man who was murdering other women and marrying a bazillion other women. But beyond that, he also scammed most of them out of their money. Because like I mentioned, these women were smart, savvy women who had to provide for themselves and had to create their own wealth. So he didn't just marry them just to marry them. And he tries to get out of this later when he's talking to the police because he says, well, not all the women I married were wealthy. I married this other woman who was not wealthy. See, proof I'm not just marrying them because of their wealth. But majority of the women that he married, even if he did not kill them, were wealthy and he scammed them out of their money. So I want to point that out because just because he does not kill these women does not mean that they were not victims. And a lot of them would testify against him. Unfortunately, there were a couple that were like, but he's amazing. I love him so much. And they would not testify against him. But majority of them did. Anyways, I just wanted to point that out. So soon after he killed Beatrice, after he drowned her in a lake, Watson would marry 2 more women, one from Vancouver and one from Sacramento. Then on March 25th, 1919, he would marry his next murder victim, a woman named Elizabeth Pryor from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. While Watson and Elizabeth Pryor were out touring near Olympia, Washington, the 2 actually began to argue with each other. And they were fighting, and at some point during their argument, Watson, quote unquote, accidentally knocked her unconscious. Oh, it was just such an unfortunate accident that, he decided at this point, I might as well finish it off. So he went to the car, grabbed a hammer, and I'm sure you can guess what he did with it. Yeah, I accidentally hit you so hard I knocked you out. Might as well kill you. Why not? This man has no soul, I swear. Look at his eyes. Look at his eyes. Anyways, 3 whole wives later, in June of 1919, he would marry his next victim, Bertha Goodrich, from North Yakima, Washington. Now, I would like to point out to you that you have probably noticed a pattern. Like I said, he doesn't kill all of his wives. Like, why? I mean, because he's a crazy person. That is the best way to explain it that I can find. But it could be that maybe some of them annoyed him. Maybe some of them got a little bit too nosy for their own good. Who knows? But like I said, he is not killing all of his wives, and there is no rhyme or reason to determine why he kills some wives and why he doesn't kill others. I'm guessing, this is just me making an assumption based off of the small amount of information I have on this man, but I'm guessing it was the wives that were either digging into his business and he did not like it, or he just got annoyed with them because they were naggy or something. That is genuinely what I think. But again, there is no rhyme or reason. So like I said, he married 3 wives and then married his next murder victim. Bertha was the next one that he did kill. And while they were on their honeymoon near Seattle, see, some of them, also this is strange to me, some of them he kills almost immediately, like on their honeymoon. And then others, he waits months and months and months, and then others, he just doesn't kill. See, no rhyme or reason. It just makes no sense. So they were on their honeymoon near Seattle, Washington, and Watson would bludgeon his new blushing bride to death and then dump her body into the most convenient lake he could find. So he again claimed that he killed this, and like I said, he doesn't like to refer to them by name or anything that would resemble a human being. He killed this victim out of impulse as well. So Bertha died out of impulse. So didn't annoy him, wasn't digging into stuff. He just felt like it. So I don't know. I can't understand how his brain works, and I don't want to because he's a crazy murderer. So a month later, in July, he went out boating with his newest bride, Alice Ludvigsen, when she, quote unquote, accidentally fell out of the boat and was drowned in the St. Joe River. Now, when I read about this accident, quote unquote, accident, I had an image of them just being out on the river in a boat, like having this romantic moment, and he just like shoves her into the water and then drives the boat far enough away that she has to try and swim to it. And just as she's getting closer, I have this image of him just like pulling away and like continuously doing that until she just gets so worn out that she drowns. That's what I pictured. I don't know if that's actually what happened, but when I was reading about it, that's what popped into my brain. And it's just so disturbing. Like, think of the person that you love or thought loved you, and the last thing you see before you die is them pushing you off a waterfall or them attacking you or that person leaving you to drown. Like, that would be such a traumatic way to die. Like, oh, these poor, poor women. It just hurts my heart for these ladies. Just like every victim in any of our stories. It's just so sad. So he would go on, obviously, to marry 2 more women who would survive being his wife before he would marry one of his last victims in December of 1919. Her name was Nina Delaney of El Centro, California. A month after they had been married, so Nina was actually one of the wives that he would drag around with him for a little bit, move place to place for about a month. Well, after they'd been married about a month, her nude body was actually found outside of the town. She had been strangled, her skull had been crushed with an axe, and certain areas of her body had been slashed with a knife. And when I say her body was found, what I actually mean is Watson brought the police to her body. And I will explain more on that later. So the reason he had actually killed Nina, this one we do have a reason why he killed her besides just, I felt like it. She had actually discovered a letter from one of Watson's many other wives. Because remember, at this point, he still has a lot of living wives that he has to keep up pretense with. Like, yeah, I love you. You're the only one. Da 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 da. So he's having to write to these women while he's on his quote unquote business trips. And Nina discovered one of these letters and actually approached Watson about it and confronted him about the fact that she thought he was cheating on her, which he obviously was, and cheating on every other woman that he interacted with. But when Nina confronted him about it, it was a very, very bad choice. In fact, it was a lethal choice that she had made. But Watson's next wife would also become suspicious of her husband's extracurricular activities. But instead of actually approaching Watson directly, she actually hired a private investigator named Nick Harris. So when she spoke to Nick, she let him know that she was afraid of her husband because she believed that he was a federal agent, had a gun and everything. And the main reason that she believed this, besides the fact that he told her that, was because he kept a black satchel with him at all times that she was not allowed to open. He claimed it contained secret files that she was not allowed to see. It had his gun, so she could not get in there. She needed to leave the satchel alone. Now, I don't know about you, but if my spouse ever said, hey, don't you ever enter that room, or don't you ever open that satchel, or don't you ever fill in the blank, you best believe I'm going to go into that room, or I'm going to open that bag, or check into whatever you said that I should not be checking into. Why? Because I know you're being sketchy. You're being completely sketchy. And this woman, his newest wife, felt the exact same way. She was like, yeah, I don't like that I can't, like, there's secrets. Secrets are no fun. So she actually went while he was preoccupied and took a really quick glance into the satchel and didn't find what she expected. And remember, she thought he was a secret agent, so she was thinking it was going to be some secret agent paperwork. That is not what was in there. Now, she didn't have a lot of time to actually take a deep dive into the satchel because, Watson was in there and it was pretty dangerous for her to look. She didn't know that at the time because she didn't know he was a murderer. But, when you're trying to snoop around and you got to be quick, that's kind of where she was at. So she actually told the private investigator about this, and he said that he would take a look. So when Watson finally left on one of his quote-unquote business trips, aka his visiting tour for all of his other wives / murder tour of his wives, because he also murdered wives while gone on these quote-unquote business trips, the PI actually snuck into the home and was able to open the satchel. He had actually left it behind on this trip. And what he found was super confusing. Well, at least confusing for someone who doesn't have the same context in this story that we do. Because, we've got the wives at this point. No one knew about any of that. So the private investigator found jewelry, many, many marriage licenses, half a dozen wills. Some of them had been signed and some of them had yet to be signed, but were ready to be signed. And last but not least, he found letters from at least 20 or more women that he was planning on meeting up with and marrying. So these weren't even letters from his current wives. It was from potential wives. 20! There are 20 of them. How? How on earth? That is just, oh my gosh. So the PI immediately brought this information that he had found to the police, and Watson was finally arrested for bigamy. I know you thought it was going to be for murder, but they didn't know anything about those murders yet. That was still an unknown. They only knew, as far as they were aware, this man had a butt ton of wives and he was breaking the law because bigamy was against the law. And they think that he had up to 40 wives at one point. 40 wives at one time. Can you see why my mind was blown? Henry VIII and your 6 wives, get out of here. Not even close. 40 wives, guys. Insane. So, while he was being held in custody, being charged with bigamy, the police kind of mentioned that they had actually found a body of a woman just outside of town. Now, mind you, at this time, Watson was not a suspect of any murder of any kind. He literally was just being held for bigamy, and that was it. They were just investigating his bigamy at this point. So just keep that in mind, because they mention this body, and Watson believes that the gig is up. He thinks that they've discovered the body of Nina. So he just starts confessing to everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything he could remember. Because remember, he didn't remember all the wives' names. He didn't remember all the situations. He had convenient memory loss, but he started confessing to so many things that the police were like, oh, well, crazy. And it turns out the body they had discovered had actually not been a woman that he had murdered. But because of his confession, he had to lead the police to where Nina's body actually was buried. So that is how they found her body, is he thought they found her body, but it was someone else. So he confessed, and then it was like, oh, oopsie, that wasn't her body. I take it back. I didn't murder anyone. So after he had started confessing, he just calmly told the police about the entire murder trail that he had created all up and down the West Coast. He was so honest with them, in fact, that they genuinely thought he was making it up until he brought them to Nina's body. Like, he was just so candid with them. And that's when they actually believed him, and they started looking at the marriage licenses a lot closer that they had found in the satchel, and discovered that many of the women had actually gone missing and that no one had heard from them. So when the police asked him why he kept so much evidence that incriminated, he just shrugged and said, I cannot explain why. Well, back then, there wasn't really a lot of studies of serial killers. In fact, serial killer wasn't even a phrase or a term, so they didn't really know what to do with a situation like this. And since this all happened with the studies that have been done now on serial killers, we can tell you the reason that he kept all these things. It's because those were his trophies. Those were the things that he could look at and show that he had succeeded in tricking and killing all of these unsuspecting women. Those were his trophies. They didn't have an explanation back then, but we do now. And he loved having the control that he had over these women. He loved his ability to seduce them, convince them to marry him, and then ultimately kill them. He did get special pleasures from his killings, but that actually wasn't his main motive. His main motive was the power. He liked the power, and he gained a lot of financial gain from killing these women, but even though he stole a lot of money, it was just the power. He really liked the power that it gave him. And ultimately, Watson would take a plea deal in 1920, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was a model prisoner and took up writing poems that he actually would submit to the New York Times. And one of the poems was ominously called, quote, My Ideal Wife, unquote. Oh, let me guess, that poem was one word. Dead? Is that your ideal wife? Like, oh, that's so creepy. He would write a poem about that. That's so horrible. In 1939, Watson was actually taken to the infirmary in the prison with a severe case of pneumonia, and he would actually die shortly after being brought in to the infirmary. So he left a will behind that stated his $80,000 estate should be distributed between all the wardens and the Salvation Army, but no one actually knew where this quote-unquote estate could be found. The warden at the time of his death believed that this was Watson's final lie, since he only had $18.70 to his name when he died. And that was all in a prison bank account. So it's thought that that was his final, no, I really am wealthy, but he wasn't. He just lied to try and make himself look better. And one last eerie detail that I want to tell you that kind of made my skin crawl when I read it was the last sentence in James P. Watson's will read, quote, "I am a widow," unquote. Oh, ew, ew. Oh, it's so creepy. That man. So I'm sure you're wondering how he got the term Bluebeard. How did he get that nickname? So there's actually a fairy tale from France called Bluebeard, and it's a tale of a wealthy merchant who married many, many women and killed them all. It's pretty gruesome if you want to read it, but that is why many people called our horrible human in history for the day James P. Bluebeard Watson, because he literally mimicked the fairy tale in real life. This man did not have a beard, but much like the fairy tale, he could not seem to stop marrying, and he could not seem to stop killing. And I'm sure a lot of you have not heard this story before, and so I hope you enjoyed this horrible tale about our horrible human in history. So if you did like this, make sure you're liking and subscribing so you get notified every time we post a new episode. And if you have someone you want to hear about, I want to know, let me know. I can do an episode for you and I'll give you a shout out. So be sure to tune in next week as we explore an area that freaks me out a little bit. I'm not going to lie. We are going to be talking about a cult leader whose murdering spree took place to enhance her voodoo powers. Voodoo freaks me out. I'm not going to lie. Yeah, we're going to be talking about a cult leader who believes in voodoo. So that's right. Tune in next week on Horrible Humans in History as we talk about someone who practiced voodoo. Her name was Clementine Barnabet, and she was a cult leader of the Church of Sacrifice. It's gonna be a good one, guys, so make sure you tune in, and we will see you next week.